Early that bitter winter morning, a heavy, relentless thud of a fist against my front door shattered the quiet sanctuary of my home in the Hampshire countryside. Thick frost coated the Victorian window panes, and a damp, chilling mist clung tightly to the sprawling 5-acre grounds that my late wife and I had spent decades carefully nurturing. I stepped out of the hallway and pulled the heavy oak door open to find a local police constable standing on the cold threshold, clutching a formal county court possession order bearing my precise name. Across the quiet tarmac lane, half parked carelessly on the manicured grass of the opposing verge, my own son-in-law, Julian Van Smythe, leaned casually against the body of a gleaming new Range Rover. He held his smartphone aloft, recording every second of my anticipated public humiliation with an expression of unbridled, triumphant arrogance. "Hurry up, Arthur!" Julian shouted, his crisp, mocking voice cutting sharply through the freezing English air, echoing across the vacant gardens. "Your time is officially up. This estate belongs to us now." I did not yell, nor did I experience a single flicker of panic. Decades spent managing high-pressure, hazardous operations on North Sea offshore platforms had trained my nervous system to remain entirely absolute under extreme duress. I simply adjusted my spectacles upon the bridge of my nose, took the legal documents from the visibly uncomfortable officer with steady fingers, and asked one single, precise question regarding the legal validity of the court seal. The young officer's face went instantly pale, his eyes widening as the terrifying weight of a profound procedural anomaly washed over him. Standing there on the worn wooden planks of my front porch, surrounded by the biting winter air, my mind drifted briefly across the silent expanse of the property. My name is Arthur Pendleton, and I am 70 years old, a retired chief engineer whose professional life was dedicated to calculating structural integrity and preempting catastrophic failures before they could occur. This 5-acre estate in Hampshire was not merely a piece of real estate. It was a physical monument to a lifetime of labor, and more importantly, the sacred ground where my late wife and I had carved out our shared existence. Every towering oak tree, every meticulously bordered flower bed, and every floorboard inside the house held the quiet, resonant echoes of her laughter and her final months. For 30 years, this land had served as our fortress against the unpredictable storms of the world. Yet, as I stood holding the court-ordered notice of possession, I realized with chilling clarity that the most dangerous fracture in my life had not come from an external tempest, but from the deliberate, calculated betrayal of the people I had loved and protected the most. As I stood there holding the court-ordered notice of possession on my porch, the freezing Hampshire wind began to fade, replaced by the heavy, echoing memory of a miserable, stormy night exactly 4 months prior. The foundations of this elaborate deception were not laid overnight. They were carefully engineered through tears, sophisticated psychological manipulation, and the profound, ruthless abuse of a father's unconditional love. It was a bleak Tuesday evening in late November when the relentless rain lashed violently against the reinforced windows of my country home. I was sitting quietly in my private study by the warm, flickering comfort of the fireplace, thoroughly examining a technical journal regarding deep-sea maintenance, when the front doorbell rang with a frantic, desperate urgency that immediately severed the evening's peace. When I pulled the heavy oak door open against the howling wind, I found my daughter, Charlotte, and her husband, Julian Van Smythe, standing on the threshold, soaked completely to the bone and looking entirely devastated. Charlotte, a high-end luxury estate agent operating in the heart of London, was weeping uncontrollably, her mascara running in dark, jagged streaks down her pale cheeks. Julian stood right beside her, his tailored designer coat utterly ruined by the downpour, perfectly playing the part of a man standing on the absolute precipice of total, irreversible ruin. Without a second thought, my paternal instincts overrode every shred of caution. I ushered them inside immediately, providing dry linen towels and brewing a pot of hot tea to soothe their manufactured despair. Julian sat slumped at the large mahogany dining table, staring blankly into his teacup as he wove a tale of corporate disaster. He claimed that his technology startup in London was facing catastrophic collapse due to a malicious, fraudulent legal injunction initiated by a disgruntled former business partner. He asserted that all his corporate accounts were entirely frozen and that unless he secured a substantial, asset-backed restructuring loan within days, they would lose everything they owned. Then came Charlotte's calculated, devastating emotional strike. She reached across the polished wood, her fingers ice cold, and gazed directly into my eyes with a heartbreaking plea. "Father, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with theatrical perfection as she invoked the sacred memory of her late mother. "Mother made you promise on her deathbed to always protect me, to never let me fall. Do not let us lose our future." Hearing her utilize her mother's final, sacred hospital wishes as a blunt weapon struck me right in the chest like a physical blow. Before I could process the sharp pain of that manipulation, Julian quickly intervened, adopting the smooth, reassuring jargon of an experienced corporate strategist. He assured me, with a calm, persuasive demeanor, that they had no intention of claiming ownership of my home. Instead, he explained with meticulous detail that they merely needed to establish a family asset management mandate as an essential part of legitimate inheritance tax planning and a formal deed of variation to optimize generational wealth transfer under English law. Completely blinded by my lingering grief, my deep protective instincts, and the absolute trust one placed in my own blood, I agreed to review their paperwork the following morning, utterly unaware that I was signing away the entire architecture of my life's work. That blind trust, however, was not shattered by a sudden, theatrical confrontation, but by the quiet, unsuspecting passage of time on a crisp, clear Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks before the local constable arrived at my door. I was kneeling in the soft, dark soil of my beloved rose garden, meticulously pruning the antique rose bushes that my late wife and I had planted during our very first spring in Hampshire. Gardening had become my solitary meditation since her passing, a physical anchor keeping me tethered to the living world through the steady rhythm of cutting dead wood and tending new growth. As I brushed the rich earth from my heavy work gloves, a sharp flash of neon yellow caught the corner of my eye near the western perimeter of my 5-acre estate. Standing 50 yards away beside the heavy iron gate was an unfamiliar figure wearing a high-visibility construction vest over a plaid shirt and a white hard hat. Planted firmly into the manicured grass beside him was a professional tripod supporting a digital theodolite. He was peering intently through the optical lens, making precise adjustments to the leveling knobs before jotting notes onto a digital tablet. My initial assumption was that he might be a local utility technician verifying municipal drainage easements along the country lane. Wiping the soil from my forehead, I picked up my wooden walking stick from the porch steps and walked across the sprawling lawn to offer a polite correction regarding the property boundaries. As my boots crunched softly on the dry grass, the surveyor stepped back from his equipment and offered a professional, courteous nod. "Good afternoon, sir," he said pleasantly. "This is a truly magnificent piece of land." I returned the gesture with a measured smile, keeping my tone strictly cordial. "Thank you, but I must ask what brings you inside the gate." "The county boundary sits 30 yards back toward the pavement. This is strictly private residential property." The surveyor offered a slightly apologetic expression and tapped his tablet screen. "I apologize for the intrusion, sir, but I am not with the local council. I am an independent commercial contractor hired by a major corporate lender." He explained that he had been dispatched to conduct a comprehensive topographical survey and commercial appraisal of the entire 5-acre parcel. A heavy, chilling drop struck my chest, yet my posture remained entirely rigid. Decades spent managing high-pressure, hazardous operations on North Sea offshore platforms had trained my nervous system never to panic when faced with an acute system anomaly. An engineer gathers more data before drawing a conclusion. "A commercial appraisal?" I asked, my voice remaining completely steady despite the cold dread spreading from my spine. "That makes no structural sense. This is a private residential home, and has been our family's sanctuary for 30 years. The surveyor looked at me with a complex mixture of professional discomfort and pity, clearly assuming he was dealing with an uninformed elderly resident who did not understand the paperwork. "Sir, I am merely executing a formal work order," he replied gently. "According to the bank files on my screen, this 5-acre plot is actively being evaluated for a massive commercial redevelopment project." He swiped the screen and read the primary corporate applicant name aloud, and the syllables hit me like a physical blow. Sutton Holdings. The developer's notes specified an absolute, complete demolition of all existing residential structures next month to break ground on a modern commercial retail complex. The warm afternoon breeze suddenly felt like ice against my skin, and the world around me faded into a muted, ringing silence. My analytical mind instantly cross-referenced this terrifying reality with what Julian and Charlotte had sworn 4 months ago, that the asset management mandate was merely a passive, temporary shield to avoid future inheritance taxes. They had never sought management rights to protect my legacy. They had systematically manipulated me into signing away my home so they could bulldoze it into the dirt for a multi-million-pound commercial payout. The surveyor looked at me anxiously, asking if I was all right or if I was merely a tenant. I locked down my rising fury behind an impenetrable vault of iron self-control, thanked him politely for his transparency, and turned slowly back toward the house. The ground beneath my boots no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had instantly transformed into a battlefield, and the war for my life's work had officially begun. Knowing that a direct confrontation without concrete, unassailable evidence would only prompt them to frantically cover their tracks, my analytical training dictated that the absolute truth had to be unearthed directly from their own discarded waste. The following afternoon, I drove my sturdy pickup truck from the peaceful seclusion of my Hampshire estate into the affluent, tree-lined suburb of London, where Julian and Charlotte owned a luxurious townhouse. My instincts, honed by decades of anticipating structural failures before they could cripple deep-sea offshore operations, told me they would be absent, likely celebrating their impending corporate windfall or vacationing abroad. I parked a few streets away, walked up the paved driveway with a calm, deliberate demeanor, and slipped down the narrow side path toward the rear service alley where their municipal recycling bins were securely stored. It was collection day, and the bins were heavily packed. Lifting the heavy plastic lid of the recycling container, I bypassed the usual domestic refuse until my gloved fingers brushed against 2 tightly secured plastic bags filled with confidential waste. Without a moment of hesitation, I retrieved them, placed them securely on the passenger floorboard of my truck, and drove back to Hampshire without looking back. Once inside the absolute solitude of my private study, I locked the heavy oak door from the inside, spread a large canvas drop cloth across the hardwood floor, and emptied the contents. Thousands of cross-cut paper strips spilled out in a chaotic mound. Unmistakable evidence that Julian had trusted a heavy-duty mechanical shredder to permanently silence his deception, while severely underestimating the meticulous, infinite patience of a retired chief engineer. For hours deep into the night, working under the harsh glare of a single desk lamp equipped with a pair of fine stainless steel tweezers and rolls of clear adhesive tape, I performed the agonizingly slow, meditative task of alignment and reconstruction. I separated the corporate letterheads by weight, matched the precise ink densities, and pieced together the shattered fragments ribbon by ribbon, text line by text line. By midnight, the gruesome puzzle revealed its full, devastating picture: a multi-page financial prospectus and internal email correspondence detailing a multi-million-pound commercial development project. The blueprints explicitly mapped out my residential coordinates in Hampshire, scheduling the total physical demolition of my life sanctuary within less than 30 days to make way for a modern commercial complex. The betrayal was absolute, calculated, mathematically precise, and entirely devoid of human empathy, sealing the cold reality that my own flesh and blood had traded my legacy for pure corporate greed. Knowing the devastating truth buried within those reconstructed financial prospectuses and internal corporate emails, My training as a chief engineer dictated my next strategic move with absolute precision. I could not afford to act prematurely. If Julian and Charlotte even remotely suspected that I had pierced through their elaborate veil of deception, they would instantly accelerate their timeline, siphon off the multi-million-pound funds into offshore accounts, and surround themselves with an impenetrable corporate defense wall. To protect my tactical advantage and secure an unassailable position, I needed to keep them completely confident in their impending victory and entirely dismissive of me as a legitimate threat. I decided to assume the exact character they had already mapped out for me in their cynical calculations. A declining, disoriented old man whose cognitive faculties and physical resilience were rapidly eroding under the heavy burden of isolation and grief. The very next morning, I initiated a meticulous, unflinching performance of physical and mental breakdown, transforming my quiet Hampshire estate into a stage for profound deception. When Charlotte arrived under the thin, manipulative guise of checking on my welfare, I laid down the foundation of the act with surgical accuracy. As I opened the front door, I deliberately gazed at her through a foggy, vacant expression and addressed her by her late mother's name, letting a brief, calculated flash of triumphant satisfaction register in her eyes before she hastily masked it behind an overwhelming display of feigned filial sympathy. Over the following days, I escalated the performance through a series of carefully choreographed missteps. I deliberately misplaced my heavy brass keys on the kitchen counter, let my shoulders slump into a weary, defeated slouch, and frequently complained of a sharp, phantom constriction in my chest, pretending that my heart condition was rapidly deteriorating under the crushing stress of loneliness. The ultimate vulnerability of the predatory mind lies in its inherent arrogance. True to form, as the weeks progressed, their cautious vigilance evaporated entirely. Convinced that the battle was already won and that my mind was too fractured to comprehend the legal complexities of a fraudulent property transfer, they completely stopped monitoring my daily movements. This manufactured isolation, which they assumed would break my spirit, instead granted me the exact, undisturbed sanctuary I required to quietly assemble the final pieces of my counteroffensive with elite legal counsel in the capital. While Julian and Charlotte reveled in their assumed victory, completely blind to the meticulous net I was casting around them, I made my quiet move into the heart of the British financial district. Leaving the peaceful seclusion of my Hampshire estate behind, I traveled discreetly to the city of London to secure an audience with a senior litigation partner renowned for handling complex asset fraud and high-stakes financial crimes. Sitting across from him in a minimalist, wood-paneled office overlooking the gray, restless waters of the Thames, I laid out the physical fragments of the deception I had painstakingly reconstructed from their waste. Within hours, a comprehensive title search conducted through the HM Land Registry uncovered the definitive legal shield I had almost forgotten. Back in October 2018, anticipating the devastating progression of my late wife's terminal illness and recognizing our daughter's persistent vulnerability to manipulation, we had taken decisive steps to safeguard our legacy. According to the formal historical filings retrieved from the registry, our entire 5-acre estate had been placed directly into an immutable, irrevocable property trust, with a neutral corporate fiduciary appointed as the sole legal trustee. The legal implications of this discovery were absolute, striking like a thunderbolt against Julian's entire fraudulent enterprise. Because the land was bound within an irrevocable trust, I held no personal authority whatsoever to sell, transfer, mortgage, or encumber the property. Consequently, my signature on the deceitful documents presented in my kitchen was legally void from the precise moment of inception, a complete nullity before English law. Julian had not secured a genuine, marketable asset. Rather, he had deceived a major institutional lender by using a ghost property as collateral for a £2 million commercial loan from Lloyd's Bank, walking straight into an inescapable legal snare of his own arrogant making and officially crossing the line into severe criminal fraud. That meticulous legal insurance secured in the City of London provided an unassailable fortress. Yet a deeply troubling question still lingered in the corners of my analytical mind regarding the true extent of my daughter's complicity. Was Charlotte merely a passive, manipulated accessory, swept up in her husband's ruthless corporate ambitions? Or was she an active, willing participant in the calculated destruction of her own father? The definitive answer arrived during her next scheduled visit to my Hampshire estate under the thin, exhausting guise of checking on my fabricated physical decline. She arrived mid-afternoon, wearing an air of performative affection and carrying an oversized, impeccably crafted black Prada handbag, a tangible monument to the capital they had already siphoned away through fraudulent channels. Midway through her visit, under the pretext of examining the antique rose bushes we had discussed, Charlotte excused herself and stepped out onto the back patio, leaving her luxurious designer handbag completely unattended on the mahogany study table. Moving with the silent, practiced precision of a man who had spent decades navigating high-stakes technical environments where every micro-movement mattered, I retrieved a state-of-the-art, coin-sized micro-recorder from my pocket. With delicate, steady fingers, I slipped the matte black device deep into the concealed velvet lining of the inner structural pocket, ensuring it remained entirely undetectable to the touch or sight. Just 48 hours later, when she returned for a brief follow-up visit and left the bag unmonitored for a second time, I quietly recovered the micro-recorder, locked myself inside the absolute solitude of my private study, and connected the digital memory card to my desktop system. The audio file that began playing through my studio headphones initiated a cold, visceral shock that instantly froze the blood in my veins. The recording captured a private telephone conversation between Charlotte and Julian, in which they openly celebrated the impending commercial liquidation of my 5-acre estate and the multi-million-pound cash influx heading toward their offshore accounts. But as the audio continued, the chilling reality of their malice crossed far beyond the boundaries of mere financial fraud into a terrifying, unforgivable moral abyss. They were not simply waiting for legal eviction orders to process. They were actively plotting to accelerate my manufactured cognitive decline to ensure I could never legally challenge their fraudulent deeds. With chilling, detached clinical precision, they discussed the mechanics of quietly withholding my vital prescription heart medication, arranging my imminent transfer to an underfunded, substandard care facility where my voice would be permanently and irreversibly silenced forever. Listening to my own flesh and blood calmly calculate the deliberate termination of my life for the sake of real estate expansion acted like a sudden, cleansing fire through my soul, incinerating every lingering ember of paternal mercy or emotional hesitation. The grieving, forgiving father who had spent months agonizing over the family's fracture died permanently right there in the dark of that study. In his place stood an unyielding, resolute sentinel, a man whose absolute boundaries have been drawn in permanent stone. The last remaining threads of emotional attachment snapped cleanly away, leaving behind a profound, terrifying clarity. They had not only stolen my sanctuary and weaponized my grief, they had measured the value of my remaining years and found them entirely expendable. With the final proof of their premeditated cruelty secured and safely backed up on secure servers, the trap was fully primed, and the predators had no remaining avenue of escape from the reckoning they had so arrogantly invited. Returning from the grim shadows of my study to the freezing reality of the present moment, I stood once again upon the worn wooden planks of my front porch in Hampshire, the bitter morning air thick with palpable tension. The local police constable stood directly before me, shifting uncomfortably from boot to boot as he finalized a mandatory reading of the county court possession order that threatened to strip away the entire foundation of my existence. Across the quiet tarmac lane, half-parked carelessly on the manicured grass of the opposing verge, my own son-in-law, Julian Van Smythe, leaned casually against the body of a gleaming new Range Rover. He wore an expression of absolute, unbridled triumph, holding his smartphone aloft to record every second of what he firmly believed was my ultimate public humiliation and final downfall. Maintaining the absolute, unflinching composure of a seasoned engineer who had successfully navigated life-threatening crises on high-pressure industrial platforms, I did not betray a single microscopic sign of panic, hesitation, or emotional distress. Instead, with deliberate, unhurried calm that starkly contrasted with the chaotic theater unfolding around me, I reached into the deep inner pocket of my winter coat and withdrew my smartphone. With a steady thumb, I smoothly established an instantaneous wireless connection to a heavy-duty, high-output Bluetooth speaker that I had concealed cleverly among the lush green fronds of the potted ferns resting quietly upon the porch railing. With a single, unwavering tap of my finger against the glass screen, I pressed play on the pristine, unedited audio file captured directly from my daughter's designer handbag during her performative visit. The crystal-clear audio erupted from the speaker with staggering, thunderous intensity, instantly shattering the fragile morning silence of the Hampshire countryside. Charlotte's cold, calculating voice filled the air, publicly exposing their fraudulent multi-million-pound loan secured against Lloyd's Bank through forged registry documents and a nullified quitclaim deed. But far more devastating than the financial crime was the chilling exposure of their premeditated moral depravity. Their clinical discussion regarding the deliberate termination of my life by withholding my vital heart medication and abandoning me to an underfunded care facility to permanently silence my voice. The local police constable physically recoiled in absolute shock, his hand dropping instinctively toward his utility belt as the horrifying reality of an active, unfolding conspiracy to commit fraud and calculated murder washed over him. Across the quiet lane, Julian's smug, triumphant grin vanished in a fraction of a second, completely obliterated by a mask of absolute, paralyzing terror as his own voice echoed back at him across the neighborhood. Down the street, front doors clicked open as neighbors and local residents stepped out onto their manicured lawns, listening in stunned, horrified disbelief to the undeniable confession of betrayal broadcasting from my porch. What was intended by the conspirators to be a routine, quiet civil eviction had been masterfully transformed, in a matter of seconds, into a major criminal exposure that would seal their complete and irreversible downfall, turning the arrogant predator into a trapped animal before the unyielding eyes of the law. The final echoes of Charlotte and Julian's recorded confession had barely faded from the crisp morning air of the Hampshire countryside when the quiet country lane transformed into a scene of overwhelming, military-grade tactical precision. Right as the audio recording concluded, a convoy of unmarked, heavy-duty black vehicles belonging to the United Kingdom's Serious Fraud Office, alongside swift response tactical patrol units from the local Hampshire Constabulary, surged into the area from all directions simultaneously, completely, sealing off both ends of the property. There is no room left for negotiation, hesitation, or escape. Julian Van Smythe, his smug and arrogant composure entirely shattered by the sudden onslaught, was forcibly pulled away from his Range Rover and slammed across the bonnet of the vehicle as federal and local officers secured his immediate, rough arrest. Meanwhile, Charlotte stumbled backward in sheer, paralyzing disbelief, sinking down on her knees on the cold tarmac as she wept hysterically, finally realizing that every single avenue of evasion, deception, and legal manipulation had been permanently locked down by the weight of incontrovertible proof. Senior investigating officers stepped forward through the gathering crowd of astonished neighbors, immediately addressing the profound legal reality of the situation before the local authorities. They formally confirmed that Julian's multi-million-pound mortgage application, built upon fabricated transfer documents regarding an irrevocable property trust, constituted a severe commercial fraud under the Fraud Act 2006. The massive financial leverage he had fought so ruthlessly to secure was exposed as an illegal illusion built entirely upon a ghost property, paving the way for immediate, wide-scale asset freezes and official charges of conspiracy to defraud and commit targeted physical harm. The intricate trap, forged through months of meticulous patience and absolute logical clarity, had snapped shut with flawless, merciless precision. The wheels of British justice turned with a cold, unyielding efficiency in the months that followed, culminating in a swift and uncompromising trial at the Crown Court. Without the possibility of mounting a viable defense against the overwhelming weight of digital and forensic evidence, both Julian Van Smythe and Charlotte received consecutive maximum prison sentences at a high-security correctional facility for multi-million-pound commercial fraud and conspiracy to commit targeted harm, stripped of any prospect of early parole. Meanwhile, the institutional lenders and the court-appointed receivers moved swiftly to liquidate every trace of their ill-gotten luxury assets, from the high-end London townhouse to their designer possessions, to recover the stolen capital, reducing their manufactured wealth to dust. With my predators permanently neutralized behind reinforced prison walls and the legal machinery of the state having completed its unyielding course, I turned my attention back to the 5-acre Hampshire estate that had served as the epicenter of this profound emotional war. Though the irrevocable property trust had successfully shielded the land and exposed their multi-million-pound crime, the familiar halls of the old house were now permanently shadowed by the heavy, painful memory of betrayal. Every room echoed with the phantom sound of calculated deception, and the gardens where my late wife and I had planted our shared dreams felt quietly altered by the malice that had sought to destroy my final years. Operating strictly within the proper legal framework of the trust one had personally architected years prior, I instructed my legal counsel to formally dissolve the structural restrictions and prepare the property for immediate liquidation. I had no interest in selling to another ruthless corporate entity like Sutton Holdings. Instead, I meticulously vetted potential buyers, eventually selecting a highly respected, ethical development firm out of London that specialized in sustainable, community-focused residential projects. They recognized the immense inherent value of the premium acreage and offered a completely clean, immediate cash transaction, fetching a substantial multi-million-pound sum that provided absolute financial closure. That closing day marked my final, permanent farewell to the Hampshire countryside, a landscape that had contained both the absolute pinnacle of my life's happiness and the deepest, most devastating sorrow imaginable. Standing on the porch for the last time, I locked the heavy oak door, surrendered the keys to the new custodians of the land, and felt a profound, invisible weight lift entirely from my shoulders. Seeking a complete geographical and psychological sanctuary far away from the ashes of the past, I traveled southwest, ultimately purchasing a breathtaking, ultra-modern penthouse condominium, situated high above the vibrant, sun-drenched coastline of Cornwall. From the expansive floor-to-ceiling glass panels of my new residence, the vast, rolling expanse of the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, offering an unhindered panorama of untamed beauty. The heavy, oppressive shadows of my old study were permanently washed away by the bright, restorative energy of the coastal sun and the clean, mineral-rich air sweeping across the cliffs. The physical and psychological transformation I underwent in the months that followed was nothing short of remarkable. Freed from the toxic burden of isolation, grief, and familial betrayal, my body responded rapidly to the rigorous daily routines I established along the rugged coastal paths. I returned to consistent physical conditioning, ate exceptionally well, straightened my posture, and allowed the razor-sharp clarity of my engineering mind to rest in a state of tranquil productivity. The frail, disheveled persona I had once feigned to protect my tactical advantage was completely banished, replaced by a renewed vitality, a deep internal strength, and an unwavering mental sharpness. The steady, rhythmic crash of the ocean waves against the Cornish rocks felt like a daily baptism, washing away the bitter residue of yesterday and replacing it with the quiet, unshakable peace of a man who had successfully reclaimed absolute sovereignty over his own destiny. Standing out on my expansive glass balcony in Cornwall during a brilliant amber sunset that painted the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean in shades of gold and deep violet, I knew my definitive victory required one final, constructive act. The sheer cruelty of Charlotte and Julian's calculated plan to quietly cancel my essential heart medications had left a profound, indelible impression upon my soul. I could never simply forget the chilling reality that countless vulnerable elderly individuals across the United Kingdom actually suffer and perish in silence, simply because they cannot afford the prohibitive costs of their life-saving prescriptions. Taking a substantial portion of the multi-million-pound proceeds from the estate sale of my former Hampshire home, I formally established a heavily endowed medical charity in the loving, honorable memory of my late wife. This foundation was specifically engineered to provide direct, unyielding financial assistance to elderly patients struggling to bridge the gap between their fundamental survival and their basic human dignity. In a deeply poetic twist of fate, I had taken the exact weapon my enemies intended to use to extinguish my life, prescription medications and the fragility of human survival, and transformed it permanently into a protective shield for thousands of strangers in need. Raising a crystal glass filled with sparkling mineral water in a quiet, solitary toast toward the endless horizon, I looked back across the winding, treacherous path that had brought me to this serene destination. Life had tested me with the ultimate crucible, stripping away the comforting illusions of familial loyalty and forcing me to confront the darkest corridors of human greed. Yet, standing there bathed in the restorative sea breeze, I realized the most expensive, invaluable lesson of my 70 years on this earth. True maturity, self-preservation, and self-respect are far more sacred than blind, unconditional family indulgence. Society often tells us to forgive everything under the sacred banner of bloodline, but true wisdom dictates that there are strict, unyielding boundaries where forgiveness ceases and self-preservation becomes an absolute duty. Never hand over the keys to your survival to anyone who wears the mask of a loved one while plotting your ruin. If Arthur's journey of quiet dignity and absolute justice resonated with the deep, unspoken truths of your own life, please select the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughtful perspective in the comments below. Let me know from where you're listening today. Thank you for your time and company, and I will see you in our next story.